so this is take two because apparently my camera doesn't record audio anymore. So I guess here we go.
Hopefully this is as good as the first one. The first one was Emmy award-winning stuff.
Pure gold.
It was real good.
If this one isn't, it's just blame the camera.
Sorry, blame the camera, not us. We did our best.
Yeah. Well, let's dive in with question one, which is how can classroom management act as a foundation for student-centered and democratic classrooms? Luke, do you want to start us off with that?
So I was thinking with this, I thought back to the Collins reading. I was trying to think of what is a democratic classroom, and so I was thinking that democratic classrooms are spaces, and this is what Collins kind of goes over, just going deep into sort of Dewey's philosophy on it. Are there spaces that promote critical thinking, equality, and just a promotion of democratic principles? And so, you can, build classrooms like this in a variety of ways, but I thought that one of the most important things that Berger touched on was critique and feedback, and sort of creating a space where critique and feedback is given in a respectful way, in a timely manner, and it's done in a way where teachers can do it to students, they can critique students, and students can critique teachers, because that in and of itself will provide students with the opportunity to sort of challenge authority figures or critique authority figures, which is going to become an important aspect of their daily life in a democratic society.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that seems like a norm that you would have to establish early on in a classroom. Teaching people how to give feedback, how to receive it, establishing respectful boundaries, things like that. And with the creation of those norms, I think to make it an especially democratic and student-centered classroom, have students actively get involved in that creation, make that a discussion at the beginning of the year.
Right. It's like establishing those norms, being vulnerable, that kind of ties into it a bit. But yeah, just having that conversation with students and being able to have a space where students can freely speak their minds in a respectful manner. It's like you touched on, like establishing a norm for respect. What does respect mean for all the different students? And how can we practice that? That's the question. That's the kind of conversation you need to have at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, and I think to build off one thing that you just said there, creating a space where students can voice their opinions in a space that's grounded in equity and access to that kind of open communication is the physical setup of the classroom. I think it helps guide that, helps open up the space so much. At the beginning of the year, you have to decide how are students going to sit in this classroom. Is it going to be rows, right? Because that's not equal access to voice. The students in the front are going to have more access to the teacher. They're going to be more visible to the other students. They're going to be more engaged and more active participants, whereas students in the back are cut off from those conversations.
Proximity, I feel like.
Yeah, proximity is a big, absolutely. Touching on Berger again with that, right? And where's this teacher standing? Are they at the front of the classroom, everyone's looking at them, or are they in the very center? Or are they mingling around with the students, walking through desks?
Are they behind their desk?
Are they behind their desk in the corner of the classroom? Where is the teacher going to stand? And I think to adhere with democratic principles, they're kind of walking through and engaging with students, really getting in there. I think that ties in the best with that. And another aspect of creating that democratic physical space in the classroom is having art and decorations and quotes and things like that that represent a variety of backgrounds, a variety of races, religions, and all sorts of identities.
And also quotes, I guess, that could, just to build on what you're saying, quotes, and tie it into past stuff we talked about, quotes that ask students to think critically. It's you could have quotes from philosophers or thinkers from a variety of different cultures that ask students to sort of ask a question. If they're just sitting there in class, hopefully before class, not during the class, and they're just reading a quote, they can just be like, that's an interesting thought. And kind of just in a subtle way, it sort of practices those critical thinking skills. But it promotes that idea of this is a class where we ask questions like this.
Yeah. Well, and I think another aspect of creating that physical space would include having students maybe suggest pictures to put up, quotes to put up, things that they connect with, things
Yeah.
that they like, things that tie into their background, or things that they've made. So, in our past experience, some classrooms we've been in together have had, students painted a mural, maybe related to content or to shared memory that the class has had. And, as you go throughout different generations of students, some things won't make a sense, but that gives students the opportunity to maybe paint over things and add on to the classroom.
I think that's an important segue into question two. Something that we kind of talked about in the first take was like having students feel feel that they are valued in the classroom. And like we should be making sure that our pedagogical approaches are sort of promoting those ideas, that student voices matter. And that the classrooms that we have are in fact student centered, and they focus on how can we take your interest and bring it into what we're teaching.
Yeah, so I think what we talked about before too with content, right? Having, you kind of dove into that earlier. Do you want to do that again? Talk about
content. The number one thing, and I think it builds also on what you talked about a bit, but like in not just posters that include people like students of various backgrounds, but also in instruction. You have lessons that are catered towards bringing in various different cultures into the main narrative of the narrative of history. Let's say, you don't want to act like feminine history, history feminism is outside of the main narrative sort of thing.
So not having a Women's History Day, just having every day be Women's History Day. It's all woven into that same central narrative because they are a part of that same central narrative.
Right.
But those are kind of subtle things, I think.
Yeah, I think
that
they
can
are.
sometimes make students feel othered.
And by including them, you feel more comfortable. I guess with pedagogical approaches too. I think the important thing, one of the key ways that I think we can help make students feel more included is in things like Socratic seminars or discussions. I think asking students questions that force them to critically think, and having students ask questions that they're interested in.
Yeah, and I think that's
discussion.
That point is a really good one about inquiry-based learning, right, and collaborative learning. So having students be the ones that generate those questions, and then as the teacher, kind of guiding that to fit the standards, helping tie all these things together and synthesize them so you can actually hit those standards, right?
Right.
It's great to have students come forward with all these questions, but if they don't do that, you won't be teaching very long.
Right. Yeah.
So, but there's so many ways to give students the opportunity to come forward with questions, and something we talked about earlier too was with the Socratic seminars, having questions throughout lessons, tying those together, collecting those maybe in exit tickets, something like that, questions that they still have, things that they were interested in, making those the topics of the Socratic seminars, because those are the questions that really tie into what students care about, what they're passionate about, and I think that'll engage them, and that comes, that the resources from that, or the backing from that, comes from the collaborative learning lesson that we had in this class. I think it was lesson 9 or 10. There was a video that really dove into it. How when the students ask the questions, it shows what they're really struggling with, what they're engaged with. It allows students to use the resources that they bring to the table, right? Everyone has a different background and a different set of skills. So when they're asking questions like that, they can bring in those diverse backgrounds, and kind of building off that and going in a different direction a little bit with collaborative learning. Collaborative learning is really democratic learning, right?
Right.
When you have students doing the jigsaw assignments or Socratic seminars, they get to show their unique skills. Everyone brings something different to the table in terms of, maybe the student's a strong reader or a strong speaker, and it helps them become better
it's like
better
students
equipped
have to, students kind of have to work together. They have to
Yeah.
utilize what their skills. They have to know what their skills are, what they can bring to the table, what they can offer, and like bringing students in from a variety of different backgrounds can also help with that sort of thing. So I think it's actually a very important way, collaborative learning. And I think one thing that I looked at, I didn't touch on in the first take, but it was problem solving learning, or like it's where you ask, it's like builds into inquiry based learning, which I think we kind of went over. You kind of like give students a authentic problem for them to solve. And then together they have to sort of create a solution, and it kind of forces students to work together, which maybe they're not used to, especially in a diverse setting. It's like I'm not used to working with people that are of a different culture than I am, or a different like, whatever it is. They're all like that will build and help skills that are going to be useful in the future, and will build a democratic space.
And there's a number of ways to do that. Those inquiry-based learning activities, right? The students don't have to come up with all of the questions all the time. Like in our PBL chats, that's a great example of inquiry-based, like guided inquiry-based learning, where the educator kind of puts those questions out there for the students to solve, but really kind of hands over the reins to them. It can help kind of push them in the right direction along the way and help them think more deeply about things, but it really is still very student-centered.
Yeah, I agree. I'm trying to think. So I think we can segue to the third question now. So how have we addressed how our learning impacts our ongoing understanding of teaching and learning? That is not the question. How can various classroom and school approaches create more equitable and inclusive educational experiences for diverse learners? We touched on this quite a bit already. I went over it with the slide thing. We went over it with the
diverse narratives.
Yeah, the diverse narratives, with the posters. It's that sort of thing. But I think one of the most important things to touch on is that Kumashira reading that we read at the end of the year. That sort of asked educators to constantly question what they know to be true, and to sort of attack, like try to counter the problem, or defeat the problem of common sense, like this idea that like we think we know everything that there is to know about the world. Like there is certain aspects of the world that are just sort of, they're natural and they are a part of it, like parts of our society and our social life, and like that sort of thing. Those things are all normal. How our education structure is structured normal. Like those relationships between different groups, that's like just a normal aspect of that, like a normal thing. We don't question those things. We don't teach students to question those things. And to build like a democratic space is to create an equitable and inclusive educational experience in that way, because you're asking students to critically think about things. It's tying back in that first sort of definition from Dewey.
Yeah, and you really have to constantly challenge that idea of what is common sense, because our society and our educational system is built on one idea of common sense that is very Eurocentric. It's really built towards straight white men. And so I think by just digging into different students' experiences and having them be active participants in the classroom, the classrooms are by their very nature diverse in a lot of different ways in terms of ability, gender, sexuality, race. And we're not always going to have a classroom that is racially diverse or anything like that, but there's so many different ideas of diversity that can show in a classroom. And just by having students share their voices and ask their own questions, the classroom is going to be a more diverse and equitable space. When you're not the one deciding what content is being talked about all the time, which questions are being asked.
And it does, that goes back to the point we made earlier, like students should feel valued, like all students should feel valued in that way, like they should feel like represented and their voices should be heard. And that should be coming from how, like, not only just discussions, but also just going back to the stuff that we talked about, like when they see that they're represented, people from their cultures or whatever are represented in lectures or just on or in the main narrative, they are going to kind of subconsciously know that this is a space where they and the people that they hail from, they are valued, which I think kind of ties it into a little neat little ribbon or whatever.
Yeah, and I think as an educator, there are some things you can do. Like you by having them express their voices and their experiences, you hit that diversity. But you have to make sure that the classroom is an equitable space because there are things that you have a lot of control over.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
you know, like the content, of course, you kind of get to dictate, but your guided notes or your PowerPoints, or you know the kinds of assignments you are giving out to students.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you going to make students do a lot of reading outside of class?
Right.
You know, some students might not have time if they're watching siblings or working jobs. Are you going to require them to do an assignment about their heritage?
Mm-hmm.
You
What
know,
does
that
look
was
like for some students?
yeah. There was an experience I had when with a student I was tutoring who couldn't do an assignment because they didn't know about their heritage because
Right.
they couldn't trace it back because their ancestors were enslaved.
Right.
There just weren't records, and it's harder to do that.
Right.
So just being cognizant of what students have access to in terms of materials, in terms of records, is so important when designing a class and designing lessons.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. So I think that's a good place to close. I think just being cognizant of, because I think you touched on class a lot with that, which I think is an important aspect of, you said it in the last take, but like it's an important aspect of diversity that you cannot overlook. It's just as important as any other kind of cultural, sexual, whatever, orientation or, however it is, that is just as important. So yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. I think we've kind of touched on all the questions. So
yeah, it all really ties together very nicely. The questions are separate but so interconnected. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. We look forward to hearing back from you.